Number 10. His own hubris. In the 2000 Spider-Man films, we saw Norman Osborn meet his end in the stupidest of ways. For a villain that even in the film franchise is supposed to be a genius and a master manipulator, this was honestly, I gotta be real with you, a pretty dumb move. He and Spider-Man are having a standoff and he comes up with the brilliant idea mid-fight to finish off Spider-Man by impaling him with his glider. Norman, please. You would think this would be a brilliant plan, except for the part where it's, well, not. You see, the problem is that Green Goblin is just behind Spider-Man, meaning that the glider would impale him too. This becomes more of an issue when he goes for it and Spider-Man, possessing, you know, Spidey sense and being pretty quick to react to an attack, just jumps out of the way, leaving Green Goblin in the way of his own glider and resulting in him impaling himself and dying. Nice one, Norman. I mean, you can't even blame Spider-Man for that one, that's just you did that to yourself. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, be sure to show us you love us, feed that algorithm by clicking that like button. Number 9. Always wins. Iska isn't necessarily a villain in the comics, but she has leaned that way in some more recent stories in the last few years. Initially, she was on the side of Arakko, which, while not inherently bad, were fighting against the mutants of Krakoa, of Earth, and also were allied with the Daemons of Amenth. So yeah. She also turned her back on her own people when Uranos came to attack Mars, which became the new home of the Iraqi mutants, known as Planet Arakko. And this apparently wasn't the first time that she'd done something like that. The interesting thing about Iska, like some others on our list, is that her powers are in fact her own weakness at times, as long as someone is smart enough to know how to best use them against her. That is what we see in her fight against the Fisher King. You see, Iska always has to win, whether it's in a bet, a fight, or simply a debate of wills. In this case, the Fisher King challenged her to a battle of understanding loss, and since she has to win, this caused Iska to feel the loss of all that her powers had caused her to give up with her victories, forcing her to feel emotionally defeated and thereby remove herself from the Great Ring of Arakko, ultimately giving the Fisher King what he wanted, and so in that way, he beat her at his own game. Number 8. Overcomplicated plans. While Lex Luthor might be the most brilliant Superman villain in the comics, his film adaptation leave much to be desired, and it is for this reason that he made our cut. Don't believe me? Well, you might need to rewatch Batman v Superman, which paints him as the villain behind the showdown between the two heroes who are usually portrayed as being BFFs, normally, in the main continuity at least of the comics, instead of making the president the one who issues the order to make them fight, and more revolve around their different ideologies of Batman sort of going a little crazy in his old age, which is what we got in the comics, and it makes, I would say, some more sense. Lex's plot here is so intricate and so haphazardly built on hoping that people will make the move that he anticipates. I mean, you could argue that Lex is just that good at reading and manipulating people, but I'd wager that it's more likely that he's just honestly lucky here. If he was really a genius, he probably would have made the plan, I don't know, more direct. Less room for things to go wrong. Just kidnap Martha and make them fight already. And let's not forget that Lex has no real motivation for this plan either. At the very least, not Batman's involvement. And let's not forget in the 2000s when all Lex Luthor's plans just revolved around real estate. That was also a weird time. Number 7. Mirrors. Mirror Master is actually a pretty powerful villain for being one of the more gimmicky Flash villains we have. He often either comes equipped with his own mirror gun or powers related to the mirror dimension. These powers over the years have had a variety of different effects. He can disguise himself, look into past events that mirrors have witnessed, trap people in mirrors, and even move through mirrors at times, depending on the version of the character and the story that we're talking about. But while this has been a power set for him, it's also been used against him as a weakness. In modern comics, Mirror Master ended up getting his weapon blended with his genes, which gave him mirror-based superpowers. Honestly, sounds pretty great. Unfortunately, it wasn't a good thing at first, as he ended up just trapped in the mirror dimension with no possible way out. At least initially that's what happened. So in that case, his own power kind of became his own weakness. Number 6. Bad planning. Dr. Doom, aka Victor Von Doom, has had a slew of great plans, to be fair, but he has also had a slew of, well, honestly, terrible ones. One particularly ridiculous plan that proves just how dumb the usual genius level intellect supervillain can be involved him swapping bodies with Daredevil. This plan could have been great, except it mostly just involves Dr. Doom messing with Daredevil, including a part involving a room that is giant-sized, set up as a test to prove that Daredevil is worthy of the planned body swap. Doom's plan seems to be to use Daredevil's connection to the Fantastic Four to do something. Defeat them, I guess? I would think? We never really get there. Daredevil handily defeats Doom while in his body by threatening to start a war between Latveria and China. Doom knows this would not end well and agrees to basically swap back. Oh, and apparently Dr. Doom also doesn't seem to notice that Daredevil is blind even when he's in his body. So I guess because he has his superpowers, I don't know. Number 5. Self-imposed restrictions. So Mr. Mxyzptlk is just honestly such a weird character in general. I mean, he's an imp from the 5th dimension who basically has limitless power, but mostly uses said powers to just taunt and tease superheroes that honestly he kinda admires. He's less a villain and more just like an overenthusiastic, overpowered fanboy. When you consider this, his weakness actually kinda makes sense since, you know, he is so ridiculous of a character. But on the other hand, when you consider how insanely powerful Mr. Mxyzptlk is, his weakness seems pretty insanely easy to exploit. He really only has one weakness, which is if you get him to say or spell his name, Mr. Mxyzptlk, backwards, then he will be forced to leave Earth for 90 days minimum, and all of the effects of his magic will immediately fade. Even stranger is the fact that Mr. Mxyzptlk actually chose this as his own weakness, as he is the one who apparently limits his own powers. So he was like, I gotta choose a limit, I'm gonna go with this one. It's very strange, specific, and kind of weird. Number 4. Not actually the smartest. Ozymandias, aka Adrian Veidt's villainous scheme to kill millions in order to obtain world peace honestly seems brilliant on paper. His fellow heroes never saw it coming, and he only reveals his plot after it had already taken place, being sure to cover his tracks as he went. He applauds himself and thinks he is the smartest man in the world. Even the rest of the Watchmen decide they may as well join him, except Rorschach. As such, Ozymandias underestimates his potential opponents, and Rorschach actually gets the better of him, despite Manhattan killing him. Beforehand, he was smart enough to send his journal with his findings surrounding Adrian's plans to the news. They decided to publish the information and expose Veidt for the villain he is, undoing everything he set out to accomplish and sending him into hiding. So while he may claim to be the smartest man on Earth, Rorschach still seems to somehow have outsmarted him. Number 3. Illusions that aren't solid. Mastermind can create powerful illusions, ones that feel, smell, sound, taste, and look completely real. For example, if he creates a wall, it will feel like a wall. But if you can overcome how convincing the illusion seems mentally, if you just decide to run through that wall, I mean, it isn't actually there, so it's not a solid construct. And his illusions can only exist as long as you actually believe them to be true. They require you to believe, so once you shatter one of his illusions, basically all the others will just come tumbling down after. Jason Wingard also has to concentrate for you to see his illusions, so many people have taken him out in a battle simply by distracting him momentarily. He also can't control who sees them and who doesn't. If he creates a giant butterfly in a room, all who are in the room with it will see it. Anyone who has it within their line of sight, which can sometimes work at a disadvantage for him. Number 2. Showboating. Granted, Magneto isn't intended to really be a villain in this storyline, but either way, he still acts pretty dumb and does some questionable things. This story of course comes to us not from the comics but from Days of Future Past, the X-Men movie, where we see Wolverine go back in time to try to prevent the post-apocalyptic events of the future, which is really his past. Anyways, time travel is confusing. Magneto is trying to help prevent this future as well and aims to kill Mystique in order to do so before an event can take place where she is caught on camera and basically terrifies all of humankind, causing the huge war between humans and mutants, which leads us of course to the future, which is, like I said, Wolverine's past in his mind. When this fails, Magneto decides to take control of Trask's Sentinels and have them kill the president. Not a terrible idea, until he decides to fly in and drop a stadium on the lawn of the White House and confess publicly on television that he, a mutant, was responsible for all of this destruction. Wasn't the whole point of you trying to do this initial plan to avoid what you just did? Magneto, please. Number 1. Her own suit. Asbestos Lady's own suit is made out of fireproof material, but that material is, well, asbestos. This is why Asbestos Lady would later on actually die, because of her own suit, which was also said to give her cancer. Of course, Asbestos Lady was a product of her time, which is why her suit was made out of this material, which back then we didn't actually know was that dangerous, so sadly her weakness is kind of just a product of the time period. Number 10, Victor Zsasz. Victor Zsasz is literally just a dude with a knife and a penchant for taking lives. Granted, I'm sure he's pretty strong. I've seen him drawn as such, at least, with at times his muscles being made to look like they have muscles. But then again, he's also been drawn as having a kind of wiry frame as well. In fact, I'd even go so far to say as his wiry frame is more the status quo than his like super jacked version. Zsasz doesn't actually have any powers to speak of, but he does have an obsession for taking lives that often makes him one of the most dangerous foes around. He's relentless, and that's what you need to watch out for. Zsasz won't stop until he gets what he wants, and is also even able to ignore injuries he sustains whilst fighting to claim a life. Basically, he's just like insane. So you don't want to fight him. But also, he's just a dude. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, be sure to show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button. Number 9, Kraven. When you think about it, Kraven is kinda just a guy who's really good at hunting. But that's kind of about it. I mean, he does have some augmentations thanks to a magic potion that he drank, but he's ultimately just a man. In the end, Kraven actually did end up perishing too, so the version of him that we have in the comics now isn't even really the original version of Kraven. He's actually a clone of Kraven who was introduced as basically one of his pseudo-sons. This version of Kraven would end up taking his father's place. I think one of the most powerful abilities or powers that Kraven has is the ability in this way to kind of not die. Even the original Kraven did perish earlier on and was resurrected, and when he passed away more permanently, he lived on with his clone, Kraven 2. The last son of Kraven, which is also like really weird that he had a bunch of clones considering he actually does have sons. I'd be insulted if I was the son. Number 8, Golden Glider. Golden Glider is Lisa Snart, sister to Captain Cold's Leonard Snart and longtime girlfriend of another fellow Rogues member, Mirror Master. Golden Glider is a pretty cool and underrated character, I think. She never wanted superpowers in the Prime Earth continuity version of her story, but you know, she got them anyway. This happened when the Rogues attempted to merge their weapons with their DNA to grant them actual superpowers. Normally they just have weapons. The device they were using exploded and Lisa was caught in the crossfire, leaving her physical body comatose but granting her astral projection powers, which she could use to phase and turn invisible. Number 7, Bullseye. Bullseye isn't necessarily known for his amazing strength or anything like that. For all intents and purposes, he's pretty much just a dude with a reinforced skeleton, thanks to him receiving an adamantium upgrade back in the day. At least that used to be the canon explanation for how he became so durable. However, he is probably one of the most skilled marksmen in the world. In fact, I'd even argue that he's a better marksman than Hawkeye is. Bullseye is the villain primarily of Daredevil, but he's also fought against other heroes before, and honestly, every time he fights a hero, for the most part, he seems to fare pretty well. And even when he fights other villains too, I'd say. This is the man who was made famous for taking Elektra away from Matt Murdock and brutally defeating her. And I mean brutally. This is especially impressive when you consider how deadly Elektra alone is. The fact that he was able to take her out is honestly pretty astonishing. Number 6, Mirror Master. For a Flash villain, Mirror Master is not necessarily fast on his feet, but he does have speed in another sense. Mirror Master brings with him his mirror gun and mirror technology. This tech allows him to travel to alternate dimensions and teleport. Teleportation is kind of like super speed, but holds back any of the excuses needed to protect you or whoever you happen to be saving or running with from burning up, which is something you have to have when you're a speedster. You gotta have those excuses, otherwise it's not gonna be pretty when you're running with people. Mirror Master for this reason might not be winning any foot races against any of the heroes, the Flashes, but as long as he's got his mirrors, he can definitely still beat them to the finish line, and even beat them to the finish line across multiversal realities. So just because his powers, if we're talking Prime Earth, or abilities, if we're talking New Earth, are tied to mirrors, doesn't mean that you should underestimate him. Number 5, Jeff Bright. Originally named Jess Bright in the comics, though his name would change later on when he reappeared in the Suicide Squad series. As Jess Bright, he first appeared in The Brave and the Bold in issue 25, when he was first on the Suicide Squad. One of the strongest things about Jeff Bright was actually his connection to his partner, Hugh Evans. Both men were geniuses and best friends, and their bond and friendship often came in handy when dealing with foes as part of the original Task Force X team, aka the Suicide Squad. Ha ha ha. Jess and Hugh were both geniuses, and in the end both seemingly died on a mission after they were knocked off a cliff. However, Jess lived because he got lucky and the Yeti that was falling with him kind of broke his fall. He would return in issue 50 as the vengeful and zombie-like Koshi the Deathless, but would ultimately be defeated by the current squad members. Number 4, Beast. But only because he died. Beast was a member of the so-called original Suicide Squad mentioned in Ostrander's run that was apparently from the days of World War II. This original squad was sent on a mission to retrieve a tank, but it turned out what they were really there for was an atomic bomb. What? Beast was the member of the squad who agreed to stay behind to ensure that the rest of the team could escape, which was actually very brave of him. Unfortunately, he got gunned down and he died. It's believed, like many of the rest of the original team, that he was mostly like a normal human. His story and fateful end is mentioned in issue 26 of the original Suicide Squad series from the 80s, when Rick Flag remembers the stories that his father, Rick Flag Sr., and his uncle Jeb used to tell him about their time together on the squad. Jeb Stewart wasn't really his uncle though, he was his godfather. Facts. Number 3, Ragdoll. We talked about specific abilities before, but this one was very weirdly specific. Ragdoll was Peter Merkel Jr. and is a legacy name actually, Ragdoll, meaning that Peter Jr. wasn't the first to use it and perhaps won't even be the last to use it. Ragdoll's main thing was being a contortionist, and their MO tended to be eliminating their victims by strangling them with their own contorted limbs, which is just so bizarrely specific. They also fought with daggers though, but neither of their skills was able to save them from a bunch of ghoul-like creatures who were stalking the squad's target. Ragdoll ended up torn to shreds and ripped limb from limb by the ghouls in the 2018 Suicide Squad Annual, which is from the 2016 series but happened in 2018. That was the year it came out. Just in case anyone's like, that was from the 2016 series. I know. If you're looking for it, it might be easier for you to look up. Actually, maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe it would be easier for you to look up just 2016 Annual 1. I don't know. What helps you all find comics when I give you information? Let me know, and I'll give it to you. Do you like volume numbers? Do you like years? Do you like the year it came out? The year that of the series it was part of? So many questions. Number 2, Scorpio. Scorpio was a villain originally introduced in Steel in the New Earth continuity. However, he resurfaced in the current continuity only to be sacrificed as a member of the Suicide Squad team. Scorpio ended up on the team alongside our previous number that was mentioned, Ragdoll. While Ragdoll was first to die, Scorpio wasn't far behind him. And their death, in my opinion, was more humiliating simply because they were boasting the entire time of like how scary they were, only to find themselves drowned in what appeared to be a very shallow marsh. That's what it looked like happened. Scorpio even claimed to be more frightening than Swamp Thing. I feel like you don't make a bold claim like that and live to see it through usually, unless you are actually more scary than Swamp Thing. Scorpio was also killed by the ghouls that kept appearing near the initial target of the squad that we talked about in the previous point. Number 1, Slipknot. He's got sticky ropes. Sorry, sticky ropes that can also harden. I mean, this just sounds like some weird, dirty thing. Like, I feel like whoever wrote this, I don't know what they were thinking about these sticky ropes that can harden. Yikes. Anyways, if you don't like sticky ropes, you better watch out. Not only did Slipknot get the most unceremonious death in the Suicide Squad film from 2016, but even in the comics, he's honestly pretty lame. I'm actually surprised he lasted as long as he did. He was on the team for a short period, but wouldn't have an on-panel death until 2010 in the comics, though he didn't die in an issue of Suicide Squad, by the way. He was encouraged by Captain Boomerang during his time on the squad to try and escape, and as a result, he had his arm blown off. He suffered a worse fate in the film, though. He had more than his arm blown off. Pop. One pop.
Coming in at number 10, we've got the Riddler. Of all the supervillains throughout the universe, the Riddler is one of the most consistently interesting. He's an excellent foil for Batman, you know, the world's greatest detective. By setting up intricate puzzles and riddles for Mr. Wayne to solve, he provides all sorts of intrigue. Edward Nygma, what a name by the way, isn't terribly physically strong, nor does he have any sort of energy beam ready to fire. He's just extremely good at deductive reasoning and is able to plan very far ahead using his vast knowledge of eclectic things. He could probably be a master criminal if he wanted to, pulling off heists like no other without ever coming close to being caught. Unfortunately, he has a major weakness. He wants people to solve his riddles. He wants to be found. He's compelled to leave clues behind, pretty much no matter what. There could be a clean getaway right in front of his masked face, and he'd still find a way to leave behind some sort of tip for the folks looking to solve this crime. Really, anytime the Riddler loses, it's his own doing. You have to feel sort of bad for the guy at this point. I'm sure it was fun at first, but now he probably just wants to make a clean getaway and write some mystery novels or something. Maybe someday, Edward. Maybe someday. Coming in at number 9, we've got Thanos. Believe it or not, Thanos has a similar weakness to the Riddler. Sure, he's a gigantic purple powerhouse of a supervillain with a drove of committed lackeys that have crazy powers of their own, but he still fails in the same way as Mr. Enigma. Well, almost the same way. Throughout his various reigns, Thanos manages to take down countless heroes, even without the full power of the Infinity Gauntlet. He's got size, strength, speed, and mastery over all sorts of disciplines. Really, there's no reason for Thanos to fail at whatever he puts his mind to, but he still does somehow. It seems as though he believes that he's unworthy of his own power, therefore making subconscious mistakes and leaving openings for others to thwart his plans. So even if his weakness isn't apparent to those trying to bring him down, he'll lead them to victory somehow. Wow. Coming in at number 8, we've got the Penguin. Remember kids, smoking kills. The Penguin is another villain from the Batman universe who really doesn't have any superpowers per se. What he does have though is ruthless business sense, endless funds, and a whole lot of crazy technology. Plus he's based on a penguin. Incredible stuff really. His genius level intellect and surprising combat skills make him a formidable foe for sure, and that's not even counting his birds. But there's one thing that brings this flightless lad down. It's not an allergy to some sort of supernatural element, nor is it a proclivity for melting when exposed to heat. It's a self-inflicted wound. The Penguin has a weakness for cigarettes. That's right, death sticks, coffin nails. Didn't his mother tell him it was a terrible habit? I suppose he didn't like his parents too much to start with, but still, if there's one weakness that is extra terrible, it has to be one for smoking, even if it is through one of those fancy long-handled opera-style holders. Coming in at number 7, we've got Venom. Eddie Brock has had a rough go, hasn't he? The poor guy lost everything, decided to blame it on Spider-Man, and then got bonded with a symbiotic alien. Well, at least he got some wicked powers out of it. He's got all sorts of superhuman physical abilities, as well as the ability to block out Spidey's spider senses. Add in night vision, venomous fangs, and of course shape-shifting, and you've got a powerful villain slash anti-hero slash whatever else Venom decides to do. But alas, there are a couple of rough weaknesses that make this symbiote hunter a little less effective than he'd be otherwise. Firstly, there's the fact that fire, or really any form of intense heat, really does a number on him. Even a match could prove to be a little too much for poor Venom depending on the circumstances. Fire can be more or less avoided if you're careful though. His other weakness is a little more omnipresent. It's sound. Loud noises can take out the big lad. It really disturbs the alien. And Venom seems to operate largely in New York City, which isn't exactly known for ever being quiet. Tough break, big guy. Coming in at number 6, we've got Electro. Spider-Man, you've got it too easy. All your enemies have weaknesses that are super exploitable. You'd think that a man who can harness the power of electricity would do well, especially in a big city, but it seems as though his spirits are easily dampened. Get it? Hold on. So Electro can generate all sorts of electricity, which is extremely useful when he weaponizes it. He can also propel himself along with electromagnetic energy and even teleport by turning himself into electric current and jumping into wires. That all sounds super great, right? Like it's nice to be Electro, but it's too bad that water can essentially stop him in his sparky tracks. There's the old idea that electricity will travel quickly through water, electrocuting anyone in contact with the liquid. Well, I mean, when it comes to Electro, water will just short circuit him. Womp womp. This wouldn't be too big of an issue, but Electro lives on Earth, you know, the planet covered in water.
Even if a villain can see the future, it doesn't always mean they'll be the most useful in a fight either. Like this next villain. Destiny is honestly one of my favorite characters in the comics right now. Her relationship with Mystique, her dismissiveness sometimes, her sassiness, the fact that she was pretty much one of the only people standing in the way of Sinister taking over initially in Sins of Sinister, all of this and more make her an amazing character to read about. But just because I can acknowledge how great her strengths are, doesn't mean I can't acknowledge her weaknesses too. Destiny is more of a person who advises on fighting than actually does the fighting herself. She doesn't have super strength or endurance or toughness. In fact, up until recently, she was dead for a really long time in the comics, proving just how squishy she is and can be. In a fight that comes to blows, she's not exactly the one you'd want in the middle. Instead, she's often better served kind of staying off to the side, watching and looking to the future for strategies on how best to win here. Seeing the future is one thing, but how about villains who can see into and even control another's mind? Dr. Psycho gained more prominence thanks to his inclusion in the Harley Quinn animated series. Currently in the comics, he's one of Wonder Woman's main foes. That's just how powerful he is. hubris. And in the Harley Quinn animated show, he was also revealed to be pretty powerful and even faced off against Harley Quinn using a helmet to amplify his powers, kinda like how he's done before in the comics. With this helmet, he was able to control Darkseid's parademon army. However, the fact remains that while Dr. Psycho can control other physically powerful beings to make them do his bidding, he actually wouldn't be as good himself alone physically in a fight. Without his helmet, the best he can do is actually control 1 or 2 people at most, so against all of the Amazons, let's say, he would be struggling. This next villain has something in common with Dr. Psycho. He also typically gets others to do his bidding. Arcade is pretty messed up when it comes to what he's capable of doing. His main thing is being the guy to make crazy death traps for people to fall into and then later try and escape. And for the most part, he doesn't even really make those necessarily himself. He hires other people, he holds people ransom to basically get them to do his bidding for them. He is the creator of the deranged amusement park-like location known as Murder World. He's kinda like Jigsaw, but without even any moral code. However, I'd argue that both are equally deranged when it comes to their outlook on life and how they choose to treat other people. But I mean, at least John thinks he's doing something that can help people, whereas Arcade kinda just does it because he thinks it's a fun way to kill people, which is his job as an assassin for hire, I suppose. Arcade, however, as an individual is honestly just a guy. A smart and twisted guy, but ultimately, he's just a man. I would even argue that John Kramer has more of a supernatural aura about him than Arcade does. Pretty weird considering that Arcade comes from a comic book. This next villain is super iconic, which is why I felt a bit bad about including him on my list, to be honest. I'm feeling a little guilty about it, but when you think about it, the fact remains that Lex he's just a guy. I mean, he's a super smart, resourceful, and rich guy, I know, but still, he's just a man. In fact, while Lex boasts of being super intelligent, he's also made honestly some questionable moves in the past. Remember when he could have cured cancer and then he just didn't? The fact that Lex Luthor manages to remain as one of Superman's greatest villains is honestly baffling to me, but it's really something only made possible by the fact that Superman is super good and does not believe in killing, because if he did, Lex wouldn't stand a chance against him. Moving on to another genius. If you know me, if you know what I like, me, Amanda, you will know that this is one of my favorite evil geniuses. Mr. Sinister was recently proven to be one of the most powerful villains around. He was so powerful, in fact, that he ended up managing to control pretty much everything and created his own version of the world in Sins of Sinister. Of course, this timeline would later be corrected and wiped out, but it's still impressive that he even managed to achieve this. But at the end of the day, Mr. Sinister is ultimately just a scientist. This means that when it comes to bronze, he tends to be kind of lacking. I know he's also usually portrayed as being a really big, kind of deezed guy in some instances, but for the most part, I would say we don't present Mr. Sinister that way, and he doesn't have super strength or anything like that. But he probably takes care of himself. He probably goes to the gym. However, case in point is his fight against his one-time nemesis Tarn the Uncaring, a mutant of Arakko. Now, Tarn is an example of someone who can play with genetics and be deadly in a fight. This is because of his mutant ability to alter the genes of anyone, just like that. Tarn, along with his group known as Locus Vile, were therefore able to make fairly quick work of Sinister and his group of Hellions. Our final point is an interesting one, because I feel like you could also make a case for him on a different list. A list where he would be considered the most powerful and unstoppable of villains. And of course, I'm saying that he is powerful here, just not particularly useful in a fight. Sorry, Joker. Joker is a great foil for Batman because he embodies pretty much the opposite of what Batman stands for, and yet there's also a ton of parallels between those characters. If Batman is discipline, control, respect, hard work, and justice, then Joker is disorganized chaos without regard for anyone else or other lives, more prone to throw a plan together haphazardly and messily, and of course a symbol of injustice as the crown prince of crime. It's not to say they don't have parallels, like I said, they're both also highly obsessive people. However, just because he's the opposite of Batman doesn't mean he'd manage to survive in a one-on-one fight against him. When Joker survives his encounters with Batman, it's really only because Batman allows this to be so. Let's be real. Joker might be unpredictable, which makes him a challenging foe for Bats, but Batman ultimately has more skills in a single pinky than Joker has pretty much in his entire being, I would wager.
And at number 10 is Cyber. Adamantium encased arms and body, claws that inject victims with hallucinogens, mutant psychic tracking abilities, and even the ability to cast his consciousness into other bodies. Silas Burr has, or at least had, a truckload of impressive abilities and should be a huge threat, but he just kinda isn't. I'm not really sure why Cyber has been made to just kinda suck, but he really has. He was even responsible for giving Wolverine one of his most severe beatings up until that that point in his very long life, and was partially responsible for not only Wolverine's training, but Dawkins as well. But in the gallery of Wolverine rogues, he just doesn't really have anything else to his name. He mainly worked as a lackey to other people, and even though he has all the advantages that he has, he doesn't really become much of an issue for his opponents. He trained Dawkins, but that boy takes Cyber down pretty readily. I believe at this point he is on his 4th or 5th body as the new Hornet, and he has transitioned to be a villain for Ben Reilly's Scarlet Spider. And nothing against Scarlet Spider, I like that character, but Marvel downgraded him from Wolverine to not Spider-Man.
Number 9. Starlet. Starlet is a villain that we get to meet in the series Batman White Knight Presents Harley Quinn, which I gotta say, even now I'm kind of still reflecting on this series. At first I read it, I didn't feel super impressed, but it stuck with me a lot, which I think is a testament to it. The artwork in that series is also really beautiful, and honestly I think it's worth a read just for that, but the story, a twisted sort of criminal mystery / drama, is also quite good in this 6-issue mini. Starlet is the villain of the tale, with her true identity being revealed later on. Harley joins the case to help apprehend Starlet as a consultant. Starlet is targeting old Hollywood stars and killing them in Gotham as part of her plot. I don't want to spoil the ending of this one in case you want to read it, but you have yet to do so I will just say this. While Starlet is revealed to have some inside information, which is a big part of what makes the villain so deadly and ruthless, Starlet's weakness lies in their capacity to think logically and overestimate their value. In other words, a classic villain weakness in my opinion, that of ego or hubris, alas. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we're talking about here and you love basically characters that are kind of off kilter but have some pros and have some cons, be sure to check out our top 10 weirdest playlist where we talk about a lot of characters that basically are that.
Number 8. Stilt-Man. Oh, Stilt-Man. No list of useless or less than impressive villains is complete without his inclusion. He is the biggest joke in Marvel's villain community and has been embarrassingly defeated by a large number of heroes, most of whom have much larger fish to fry. But his stilts? Top-notch feat of engineering. What are some uses we can think of for his stilts? I mean, outside of obviously reaching the top shelf or painting the hard to reach spots in a room, I could see this being incredibly useful for construction work or for firefighters or any kind of emergency service. Outdoors electrical work would be a breeze if you wouldn't need to use one of those big skyjack cranes. Window washing would be a big one. I mean, they could even be used for transportation. You know how much faster you would get from place to place with legs being that long? I think we can agree being able to stand at 290 feet would have a ton of helpful uses, but fighting superheroes is very clearly not one of them.
Number 7. KG Beast. KG Beast has to be one of the most embarrassing villains around in the comics in my opinion. Despite being a supposedly trained and extremely gifted fighter and tracker, half the time or more it seems like he misses his shots in terms of completing hits tasked to him, and he almost always ends up dead. Like, not a great assassin, I'm just saying. More recently, this once again happened when he threatened the life of Barbara Gordon and came face to face with Nightwing once more in the Nightwing series. Important to note that here, KG Beast was the one to make Dick Grayson forget who he was before, causing him to become Rick Grayson. This was during an attempt on Nightwing's life following him being shot. So as you can imagine as well, KG Beast was pretty handily defeated here, especially once the Titans sort of came in to assist a bit and Nightwing's friends came in to assist. It wasn't a good time for KG Beast again. Nightwing lived, but for a time would have amnesia and think he was Rick, and it was a weird time and we all like to pretend it didn't happen, but it did, so we have to acknowledge it. And not only did KG Beast fail this mission because he was basically tasked with trying to kill Nightwing, but he also ended up left for dead in an Arctic tundra of Russia. Batman basically used his grappling gun to paralyze KG Beast. This was during his time hunting him, which caused KG Beast to break his neck. Then afterwards, despite Anatoly's begging, Batman refused to help him. He was just like, I'm just gonna leave you here. And KG Beast was like, but wait a minute, don't you have to like help people? And he was like, I think if I just leave you here, I didn't kill you, just a thing that happened, you know? So bye.
Number 6. Johnny Sorrow. As someone who used to be a silent film actor before turning to a life of crime, it's almost fitting that the powers he eventually attained were all about his physical appearance. While battling the Justice Society of America, Johnny got torn apart as he was teleported to the subtle realms. Here, this incredibly terrifying eldritch being called the King of Tears years reformed Sorrow with this new terrifying form that could literally cause people to pass away as soon as Sorrow removed his mask. He was intangible with his mask on, could teleport, levitate, and manipulate energy, but he still kinda ended up being a huge disappointment. Unfortunately, his main power didn't always work the way he intended. The wizard Shazam, as an example, was only turned to stone by Johnny Sorrow, and in the case of Captain Atom, he just exploded and quantum leaped through time, which is kinda just a weird alternative, but comic books got a comic book. His ability also doesn't work on people who are blind. So when Dr. Midnight faced him, nothing happened, and Midnight simply showed Johnny a recorded image of his face which paralyzed Sorrow and let the superheroes destroy him. He has come back from this somehow, but he's just never been as threatening as you might assume he could be. Number 5, Asbestos Lady and Asbestos Man. Some villains are just a sign of the times, man. Asbestos is incredibly heat and fire resistant, and back in the day we really used to take advantage of the mineral. It was in thousands of products, and it even came into our comic books with the supervillain known as Asbestos Lady, who was fittingly a villain for the original Human Torch, the android Jim Hammond. Now, Victoria Murdoch created herself a costume made entirely of asbestos, which basically made her immune to fire when she wore it. Since it is no longer back in the day, we now know that asbestos is actually incredibly carcinogenic. Not only does it cause mesothelioma, but it also causes a lung disease called asbestosis. Of course, neither the writers of the comics nor the villain herself actually knew this at the time though, but that didn't save Victoria, as she eventually did pass away at the age of 45 thanks to idiopathic mesothelioma. Kinda surprisingly, Marvel created Asbestos Man, Orson Karloff, as well, who had no connection to Asbestos Lady other than also wearing an armored suit of asbestos. And he actually survived his cancer, but continued wearing the armor, just this time he dragged around an air canister to keep him alive. He was unwilling to fight anyone, and everyone was afraid to go near him, which led to an hours-long standoff with the Great Lake Avengers before eventually just surrendering and then apparently dying at a later date off-panel, probably from the asbestos. Number 4, Life Form. Now, look, Life Form here is potentially very powerful, and after learning about this villain, I actually kind of hope they bring him back. But George Prefrock's time in comics came and went like a fart in the wind. The son of a fanatical right-wing libertarian saw George trained by his father to prepare him for the world. Although he wanted to be an actor, George was convinced by his dad to become a scientist. His dad actually also got George a job at Advanced Idea Mechanics, but I bet his father didn't know that this would inadvertently get George exposed to the pro-gamma virus. This virus mutated George into this grotesque monster, becoming known as the Life Form. Now, George has superhuman strength, durability, a healing factor, and he can survive in water and the vacuum of space. But he's a monster. He even caused Frank Castle the Punisher to run away because his weapons had no effect on Life Form. Now eventually Frank knocked him into a river with a rocket, but George came back. Now with 2 personalities. One his normal peaceful self, and the other being the monster. George now came into conflict with Daredevil, but this time he was more of a confused monster, and eventually in an altercation with police, his heart began beating so fast that he collapsed and then dissolved into a puddle. But when he reformed, he was put into battle against the Hulk by the alien Mercy, who also turned him back into an actual man again, eventually. But this wouldn't last, as he remutated and attacked an entire hospital. This led him into conflict with S.H.I.E.L.D., who contacted Mr. Fantastic, who was actually incapacitated, so the Silver Surfer took George to a dead planet, destroyed by Galactus, and then just left him there as he couldn't bring himself to put an end to this dual personality monstrosity. And that's the last we ever saw of Life Form, just out on the remnants of a dead planet, one part of him wanting to end and the other half growing more and more hungry. Why is he useless? Because he is a massive wasted opportunity for a really cool character. And at number 3 is the Matador. There have been 2 people to assume the supervillain name of the Matador, and they were both arguably very useless. But the second Matador, whose real name is known only as Juan, is somehow much more violent and simultaneously much more useless. This Matador isn't even the main villain of the comic he appears in. When Daredevil Matt Murdock is in Monaco on the trail of a lawyer named Alton Lennox and his mob boss client, Tybalt Luca, going undercover to a party, Daredevil comes to the main attraction, which is a bullfighting ring. But oh my god, the Matador was actually in love with Tybalt's daughter Lily and was working with Tombstone. Whoa! He takes out Tybalt Luca with his sword, and then eventually Daredevil knocks out both him and Tombstone. But the original Matador, he used his cape to distract and blind people, which he tried to do to Daredevil, who's blind. Number 2, Stilt-Man. As far as concepts for villains go, giant stilts is absolutely one of the worst ones. Have you ever tried to stand on stilts? If you were even successful in doing so, you probably realized just how difficult all other tasks became when you were on those stilts. Now, imagine those stilts were 290 feet high. What's interesting is that if you go to his Marvel wiki page, Stilt-Man actually has quite a long history being involved in many different storylines, although I think it's fair to say that a lot of his appearances were just a little bit of a joke. But still, his stilts are actually pretty strong. At one point, the strength of them was able to plunge She-Hulk so far into the ground that she ended up in the subway. But on the other hand, she beat him by standing between his massive stilt legs and then just pushing them apart, causing Wilbur to fall all the way down into her arms, where she just promptly carried him like a baby to the authorities. Now don't even get me started on Lady Stilt-Man. First of all, they couldn't even give her her own supervillain name. Lady Stilt-Man? Just Stilt Lady. I don't know, man. But secondly, she was defeated by Deadpool when he opened up a manhole cover and one of her legs went straight down. Spider-Man even said that she was trying too hard and he webbed her up to a wall, which is just rude. And finally, in at number 1 is Paste Pot Pete. This guy rebranded himself and still couldn't save himself. Paste Pot Pete, or Peter Petruski, patented a multi-polymer adhesive that actually led him to become very wealthy. But being a complete doofus, instead of actually following that success, Peter decided to instead try and be a supervillain, creating a paste gun and successfully robbing a bank. Now following that, he decided he would next go after stealing a Delta cosmic missile from the military, and thanks to the Human Torch, this was a humiliating failure. Surprisingly, having your only weapon and tool as a villain, being a super glue gun, is not the key to success, and he quickly became a joke to the superhero community. He even rebranded himself to the Trapster, like I said, which is a much better name, but a little overshadowed by his time as Paste Pot Pete. Actually, that name causes him to go into a rage and is actually listed as one of his weaknesses on his wiki page. Despite his hilarious past, Trapster has been a recurring villain for years, although he's almost never taken seriously.
Number 10, Polka-Dot Man. This villain comes to us from DC, another Batman villain gone wrong. And get ready for a lot more Batman villains, cause he's just the beginning of some of the most useless. I'm not sure who would win between Batman and Spider-Man for most useless villains, but both heroes have their own pretty steep pile of terrible ones. Polka-Dot Man, whose real name is Abner Krill, is a villain who uses a polka dot suit to cause his mayhem. He has no superpowers of his own, so he relies heavily on this suit. The suit allows Abner to remove the polka dots, which can change size and transform into a variety of different weapons. Where the suit came from is unknown. Did he make it? Find it? I'd like to think the latter, because while you may be thinking this suit sounds pretty useful, and sure, maybe it does, Abner can't really seem to repair it when it breaks. Apparently the upkeep on it is so expensive that he sometimes just can't afford it. So I assume it is some kind of alien tech that is ultimately just worn by a regular Joe, which means that he's somewhat useful in a fight, but if his outfit breaks, he is rendered useless. Number 9, the Kangaroo. I love when supervillains are recognized even in the comics as being weak, and that is precisely what happens with Frank Oliver, famed jumper, ashamed boxer, and Spider-Man villain. Frank grew up obsessed by kangaroos cause, you know, he's Australian. It feels like Marvel writers were locked up in a room when they came up with this villain, and they wouldn't be allowed to leave until they had a new villain for Spider-Man. What if he's Australian? And what makes him Australian? I don't know, Jim. I'm starving. I just gotta get out of here. I don't know, kangaroos? That's it. That's brilliant. We've got it. Needless to say, Frank is a former boxer who was fired after he seriously injured a fellow boxer during a match. And his, quote, unquote power is that he can jump really well, and higher than normal. Marvel admitted just how weak he was when they decided to give him cybernetic enhancements. The unfortunate thing for Frank is these enhancements just make him jump better. Like, really? Even these improvements would not stop him from leaping to his doom in the comics. Though the mantle was later adopted by another villain and he was later resurrected. Number 8. Stilt-Man. What's better than leaping somewhat high? Walking on stilts, of course. That's the premise behind this strange Marvel supervillain. Will Brigh is a scientist who began his life of crime after stealing a coworker's design and using it to build a pair of armored stilt legs. Granted, his entire body is actually covered in metallic armor as well, and it is pretty strong. He even apparently managed to smash She-Hulk down through the street and into a subway tunnel one time during a fight. But being taller than other heroes doesn't mean you're automatically better than them, or that you're going to be helpful in a fight. For one thing, there's that whole knock the legs out from under him strategy, and 2, his armor apparently has weak spots which have been exposed in the comics before to easily take him down. Iron Man at one point even fought armor with armor by throwing one of Stilt-Man's legs right back in his face after he decided to detach them so he could jettison away, and as a result he knocked Stilt-Man out cold. Number 7. Fisherman. Any rendition of this supervillain is like a diabolical but less impressive Aquaman. As to be expected as well, he is an Aquaman villain. His Earth 1 rendition was just super into fishing, something Aquaman is not a huge fan of considering global issues of overfishing and given the fact that he is an ocean conservationist, which immediately put him at odds with the Fisherman in comics. So what can the Fisherman do to beat his nemesis Aquaman? Fish? And that's about it. Sure, he has a bunch of fancy lures, but so does my grandfather. And I don't think that's enough to allow him to take on Aquaman. I will say this, the New Earth version of him at least can breathe underwater and attempts to pull off criminal heists using the ocean and the creatures within it, but still, that seems to be his main power, and even then, he is still easily thwarted. Obviously, this villain has been deemed so useless that he hasn't even really cropped up in the New 52 or Rebirth. Number 6. Big Wheel. Ultimately a villain that could be very terrifying if he could actually steer the device that he uses to terrorize people with. The Big Wheel is a Spider-Man villain who often gets poked fun at, namely because his device is just so ridiculous. Big Wheel is actually Jackson Wheel, who unfortunately came up with the idea to have a device built by the Tinkerer based around his own name. And so he got a giant, uncontrollable wheel. Spider-Man dodges him easily in a fight, and Wheel usually meets his demise through being unable to brake and falling off the edge of things.
Number 5. Captain Cold. A lot of this is owed to the CW, but not all of it. Captain Cold has long been an antagonist of The Flash, both Barry Allen and Wally West. He first debuted in Showcase number 8 back in 1957. Leonard Snart fell prey to a rep ascribed to The Flash's villains, oftentimes by people who didn't read The Flash, namely that his villains were silly. And how could Cold be the opposite of fast? Shouldn't his true antagonist be the Turtle Man? Thank goodness it wasn't. Over time, Captain Cold would come to be the de facto leader of the Flash's rogues gallery, and a quasi-frenemy of the Flash, and one of the most well-known rogues. Then the Flash CW show happened, and now people have a crush on Captain Cold, a move that cements you in the public consciousness. Just look at Loki. Now he's got his own solo series again and is wearing terrible punny shirts that cause me physical pain. Captain Cold has been credible for a while now, but I still wanted to talk about him. Also cause I wanted to tell you about this hilarious classic tale where Barry Allen thought he was Captain Cold. It's great. Am I the Flash or Captain Cold? Number 4. Sinestro. This one may be hard for some to believe since Sinestro is so credible now and his history is iconic, but there was a time when Sinestro was just kinda meh as a villain, and the Sinestro core was pretty much just Sinestro with a yellow ring that only mattered because it was yellow and lanterns couldn't deal with yellow at the time because reasons. Sinestro suffered a few resets along with Hal Jordan, the Silver Age Green Lantern, because throughout the period leading up to Hal's death, and Sinestro's death actually, the common complaint about Hal and the Green Lantern book in general was that it was boring with a capital B. I disagree, but I read it now. I can't speak to what it was like reading it at the time. The time when you read things adds context to how it is received and thusly how much you enjoy it. It's always important to examine these things. Or don't. Sinestro first debuted in Green Lantern Volume 2 number 7 back in 1961 and was an ally to Hal at first before his true nature was revealed. However, it would be after his death, actually at the hands of Hal, and his resurrection that he would rise more more powerful than ever before, with a really lame explanation as to how he was fine, but we're just gonna let that go. Sinestro would become the leader of the Yellow Lantern Corps, or the Fear Corps, his rigid, well-disciplined personality making him a perfect threat to the galaxy and counterpoint to Hal Jordan. Sinestro is up there with the core villains now. It was hard fought. I've always liked Sinestro. I don't think I'm boring. I'm fun. Number 3. The Penguin. The Penguin first debuted in Detective Comics number 58 back in 1941. Now the Penguin started off as just your average villain, distinguished largely by his bird-like appearance and iconic umbrella. At first an affectation brought on by an overprotective mother. He was a thief who would team up with other rogues often, and he would largely vanish for a time post-crisis, but then after a tale helmed by Alan Grant, his cred would begin to rise. The aspects of his personality that made him want to be a gentleman criminal would begin to come to the fore. His desire for sophistication, which so contrasted with his appearance, made him an intriguing combination. And he was one of the villains to get the spotlight on the seminal Batman the Animated Series, which would launch the DCEU, that being the DC Animated Universe. Penguin would eventually become the owner of the Ice Club, and cement himself as a villain who had ties to organized crime and was above petty street level fare. The thing is, he can do both, and he has friends in both worlds. The Penguin is a serious villain. He's always been around, but he's definitely increased his credibility over the years. Number 2. Catman. Catman. He first debuted in Detective Comics number 311 back in 1963. He was Thomas Reese Blake, a jungle trapper who turned to crime because he was bored and had run out of money because he wasted it. He actually modeled his costume off of Catwoman, and she was annoyed that he was stepping on her turf as a cat-themed villain. Cause yes, he used to go for cat-themed items as well. He would later adopt an African-styled costume that would always suffer from the fact that he looked like a lame Batman ripoff. But then Gail Simone created the team The Secret Six, and on it was a revamped version of Catman. You know, one of those attempts to make a character hardcore and awesome, only it actually worked, largely because it acknowledged his lame past and made fun of it. Now Blake was a grizzled cat lover, yes, but no longer a hunter of them. He was a loner and a reluctant leader. He was also bisexual, which you find out because Gail Simone was tweeting about it, and about how she was gonna make it canon next time she wrote the book. Everybody on Twitter has a chance to turn to J.K. Rowling. Still, I mean, it was pretty obvious that he had a thing for Deadshot. What Secret Six really did for Catman was it made him interesting and detailed him, and I'm a sucker for him in The Huntress. Hero villain things? Sign me up. He's now been permanently upgraded to cool, or so it seems, and he even kept that costume for a bit. Now that's a feat. And number 1, the Riddler. Now some of you may be going, hold up, come on. But hear me out. The Riddler first debuted in Detective Comics number 140 back in 1948. His gimmick was that he loved riddles, puzzles, and all that kind of fare, and it would eventually become an obsession that he had to leave riddles even if they would lead to him being caught. While the Riddler would be a threat that Batman would have to deal with, many times at the start it didn't feel too dire, it was more of a game, and sometimes the riddles, well, they were lame. But over time the Riddler would get a cunning boost and go through phases of being menacing, knowing Batman's secret identity, or planning elaborate chess-like crimes where the riddles could be multi-nuanced. He would find legitimacy in games as a mastermind, and an intriguing portrayal on Gotham, arguably one of its highlights. His complexity would be increased, and his desire to be taken seriously as a villain would become a plot point. There's been a big push for him of late at the time of this recording, like in the changed ending of the animated Hush film. Personally, I'm a fan of the reformed Riddler, which is a while back in the past nowadays. Connor wants me to talk about Jim Carrey Riddler, but we're talking about increased menace and cred, not talking about taking him back to camp. Although there are some moments there, hints of darkness, that made me wish that it had been played that way the entire film. The Riddler's definitely up there with being able to be a threat to Batman on multiple fronts now, and is finally a villain other villains take seriously as well.
Number 10, Mind-Boggler. I mean, Mind-Boggler only lasted a few short years as a character, and only lasted a few short issues on the Suicide Squad team, but she really should have been so much better than she was. Mind-Boggler's powers allowed her to control the minds of others, and were so powerful that she could actually use them to get a target to do her bidding by making them basically hallucinate, creating illusions in their mind that made them believe they were doing one thing when in reality they were doing something completely different. Unfortunately, because she had humiliated Captain Boomerang in retaliation for him mistreating another member of the team, he let her get gunned down while on a mission, and then kind of just claimed after that he had simply arrived too late to help her. Rude. Man, Captain Boomerang can be pretty despicable, gotta say. Number 9, Captain Boomerang. To me, being classified as weak really just means unconventional or unique in terms of superhero or supervillain speak. It just means your skills are more specialized in usually a very niche area. With Captain Boomerang, that niche area is throwing things, often boomerangs. Captain Boomerang comes armed with various different kinds of boomerangs usually, but he doesn't really have any superpowers except being good at throwing boomerangs, which isn't really a superpower. At least initially in the comics, he doesn't have powers. I will admit that the second Captain Boomerang, Owen Mercer, the son of George Harkness, did seem to also display the ability to tap into the Speed Force, but it should also be acknowledged this likely comes from his relation to the Allen and Thawne family tree on his mother's side, not the OG Captain Boomerang side of the family, the Harkness side. Just FYI. Yeah, he's got some superpowers, but not so much on the original Captain Boomerang front. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed and you want me to talk more about cool Suicide Squad stuff, which I'm so down for. I'm wearing my shark sweater. I'm all ready for that King Shark Facts Part 2 list whenever you are. Number 8, Karen Grace. Karen was an original member of Task Force X and first appeared alongside the team in The Brave and the Bold. She was a love interest of Rick Flagg's and the two were in a relationship together, but their other teammates, Jess Bright and Hugh Evans, also had a thing for Karen, so Rick asked that she keep their relationship a secret to maintain the harmony of the team. In the end, their relationship was revealed, which did create a split in the team, and it resulted in the apparent death of both Hugh and Jess. Karen would continue on past her original appearance in Brave and the Bold, and would go on to appear as a team member in the original run of Suicide Squad out of the 80s. She was skilled in combat and espionage, and was the team's medic originally. She and Rick would have a son together, but she would later become resentful of Rick, and then join the Manhunters in secret, later betraying Rick, but then ultimately sacrificing herself in the end to save him, and double-crossing the Manhunters in the end there. Karen became more of a badass as time went on, but in the end, she was still a pretty squishy human, so yeah. Number 7, Plastique. Plastique has appeared a few times with the Suicide Squad as a team member. She is a Canadian extremist known for terrorizing nations. Plastique has attempted to blow up multiple places of import, including the Statue of Liberty in New York City and the Canadian Parliament buildings in Ottawa. Pretty much all of her attempts to cause harm to political leaders or monuments, though, have been thwarted and usually lead to her imprisonment, and later led to her recruitment onto the Suicide Squad. Plastique is one of those members who could be really cool, but is just always kind of set up to fall flat, allowing her to become more well known for failing than succeeding. Initially, she just had knowledge of explosives, but she was later given powers which allowed her to create explosive blasts on her own. I don't know what this is. I guess if I was going to do an explosive blast, this would be my move for that as a power. Number 6, Okondo. Admittedly, Okondo's powers were actually pretty cool, but he didn't really last very long on the team. He first appeared in the 2018 Damage series in issue 1, and as a result of the failed mission he was part of, he ended up in a coma. Okondo's powers allowed him to mimic other animals and their abilities. Along with being able to do this, he also seemed to have knowledge of how best to utilize those abilities and which ones were best for certain situations. Although he didn't apparently know them well enough, it seems, to avoid ending up in a coma, unfortunately. So there's that. Poor Okondo. So many cool people that are short-lived, and then so many people that are mediocre that seem to go on forever in Suicide Squad. That's always interesting to me. Number 5, Yon-Rogg. Yon-Rogg is just one of the most ridiculous villains out there in my opinion. He is from the Kree race and as such has an enhanced physiology, but beyond that he is supposed to be a menacing military leader who at one point threatened Mar-Vell, Kree champion and also a military leader. Yon-Rogg was a colonel in the Kree Imperial Army who is extensively trained in both armed and unarmed combat, and the Kree themselves are known for their military prowess and excellence as well as advanced tech. But for some reason, Yon-Rogg is rarely successful in his plots to defeat either Mar-Vell or later on one of his successors, Carol Danvers. Yon-Rogg for a brief time was known as Magnetron, being revealed to have survived the Psyche Magnetron explosion and gained his own powers as a result. Because of course Carol also gained her powers from that, but then later we learned she was also part Kree, but anyways, moving along. At one point, Yon-Rogg tries to call home to the Kree Empire and attempts to make a deal with them, but not even they are willing to take him seriously, having seemingly forgotten forgotten who he was after all these years, with him likely having been presumed dead after going MIA. Yon-Rogg, call home. Holmes says, no, we don't want any of that. Bye.
Number 4. Paste Pot Pete. Peter Petruski developed this incredibly strong glue that could have been the key to a long, prosperous, money-filled life if he had decided to sell it, or develop it further, or heck, even be a hero with it. The glue was handy. He could have been someone, but instead, this big old dingus became a criminal. But what's even better is that not only did he rob himself of a bright, non-criminal future, since he decided to call himself Paste Pot Pete, and his main shtick was frickin' glue, he became the laughingstock of all the villains. Except for maybe Stilt-Man. Sure, Peter did turn things around slightly when he changed his name to Trapster, but like, not really. The damage was done. His glue could be useful in so many different ways, not even just day-to-day stuff, like he could have gone into construction or art, and I'm sure he could have even found a way to get into weapons manufacturing, as he even was able to develop a weapon for firing the glue, but no, this Goomba squandered it all to become the butt end of a joke. It's a shame.
Number 3, Belasco. I mean, Belasco is supposed to be one of the most menacing guys in Marvel Comics, right? He's basically like a demon lord of hell and a former ruler of Limbo, which you know is a hellish dimension, so I don't mean an actual demon lord of hell, but like Limbo's kinda like hell. And I'll grant you that on paper, he does seem pretty scary. But then there is the fact that he also kidnapped a young mutant so he could mold her into his own weapon, and she ended up kicking his butt, so as she rightfully should. Now granted, this young mutant wasn't just anyone, it was magic, and we all know that Illyana is a straight up powerhouse, a force to be reckoned with. But the hilarious part is that Belasco is so egotistical that he thought he could just turn magic into whatever he needed her to be, using her, and in the end, he kind of created his own worst enemy by ever bringing her to Limbo to begin with. So yeah.
And at number 2, Mr. Mxyzptlk. Now, hear me out. I need to make it clear that I am actually a big fan of Mr. Mix. He's really cool and just a blast to read, but as a villain, he's not exactly the greatest of them. He doesn't do more than be a pest to Superman, and is even a pest to Superman's villains, mainly Lex Luthor. He has benefited Superman way more than he's hindered the guy. He is kind of worthless as a villain, I'm sorry. But that doesn't change the fact that he is one of the most powerful guys around, being a reality warping 5th dimensional imp. He's just responsible with his reality warping powers because he knows the damage it could cause. But that essentially means he isn't really a huge threat. We have seen his same powers but in the hands of an actual villain when we got the Emperor Joker storyline, and that pretty much shows us exactly the kind of things Mr. Mix is actually capable of. It's a lot, but he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he just tries to give the Man of Steel a bit of a headache, which he does succeed at doing. Still, being Superman's #1 fan makes him kind of a useless villain, but I am open to being corrected in the comments.
Number 1, Sleaze. Sleaze. Wow. I mean, I think it's hilarious how much evil Sleaze could really be doing as a villain, like on like a huge scale, considering how powerful he is, and yet he chooses to basically just be like a huge creep instead, which you know, is definitely evil in its own way, but it's still on a much smaller scale. That's interesting to me. You might know Sleaze from one of his sleaziest plots. To get back at Darkseid, he planned to force Big Barda and Superman to make a special tape. I can't say it on YouTube, but you know what I mean. He hoped to make enough money to build himself an army which he could use to then get revenge on Darkseid for banishing him. I don't even really know how that would work, because then you'd have American dollars, and like, can you use those in space? And or was he gonna make a human army? Because that probably wouldn't be too great against Darkseid. Sleaze himself, however, he's a new god, so even without capturing Big Barda or her Mega Rod, he could probably be operating much more high-level schemes, and even possibly threatening the entire Justice League. But because he's mainly just a huge creep, he usually just comes up with the weirdest, grossest plots, and fortunately is stopped at almost every corner. Thank goodness. I mean, not every corner, but almost every corner. What a gross character. Sleaze has been shown to possess powers that allow him to alter his size, make others feel emotion, especially deep compulsions of desire. He can also drain energy or powers, and can even take control of, or at least heavily influence, his enemy's mind. So yeah, he should be doing a lot more stuff, but he's Sleaze, and he was made by John Byrne, so he's just kind of a gross weirdo. Villains don't usually win the day, and yet we often acknowledge them as some of the most powerful characters in all of comics. But if they're so powerful, how can they ever lose? Why does MODOK often lose? Speaking of that question, what makes him so useless? Mainly, it's all in how he's written, I would say, and honestly in his design. His design probably lends to it as well. I mean, he's just a giant head in like a floating chair, you know what I mean? It's his little limbs. MODOK though should be a terrifying and intimidating villain, and in some respects and some alternate universe stories he is, but for the most part he is made a mockery of in the comics despite the serious threat behind his name. Initially, George Charlton was a man working for AIM who was experimented on and basically altered to become the ultimate tool for analyzing the cosmic cube, which was in their possession. As a result of his enhanced intellect, his head became massive and he was given a chair to aid him as he was no longer mobile on his own. At least, that's one of his origin stories. The chair that he was given was named the Doomsday Chair, and George became MODOK, mental organism designed only for computing. MODOK. But AIM failed to predict what other side effects the added knowledge capacity and intellectual power might have on MODOK, who turned on those who had made him and ultimately became MODOK, with a K instead of a C, to be clear. Mental organism designed only for killing. Despite his kinda epic backstory and the meaning behind his name, I think MODOK is often used as a joke villain in the comics. Which villains do you think deserve more respect? How do you feel about villains being used somewhat as comedic relief? I don't know, me personally, sometimes I like it. I really liked the MODOK series, I thought it was really funny, but also sometimes it can work against a character too, and especially like take away from their threat level. So like MODOK, Riddler is one of the villains who often just isn't that intimidating. I gotta be real with you. I mean, I love him as a villain and I love his gimmick, but there is honestly something about Batman villains. A lot of them have to have gimmicks, it seems, and for many of them it doesn't add to their capability. In fact, it kinda limits their capability if I'm being honest. Riddler is one of those. At times he can feel unstoppable, like some mastermind who is many steps ahead of Batman. Although Batman, even if lagging initially, always seems to catch up since he is known for being, you know, the greatest detective in the world. But if you also just took Riddler and put him in a room with Batman and it came down to like a round of fisticuffs, I know where I would place my bets personally. I think you know where you'd place yours too. Being physically fit, simply put, isn't for every villain. This next one included. Mastermind is one of those villains you usually never think of when you think of someone that you just like wouldn't want to fight. You'd be like, Mastermind, I guess I'll fight him, it's not that bad. But honestly, he can be pretty dangerous. His mutant powers allow him to alter someone's mind, making them see illusions or even changing their memory in some cases. He was one of the folks responsible for helping to break Jean Grey when she was at the Hellfire Club, and his interference was part of what moved her along on her way to becoming Dark Phoenix. He's also been the person that's kind of been attached to the Void, Sentry's evil persona. That being said, at the end of the day, Mastermind's powers are purely mental, which means that he isn't the most physically intimidating of characters. Also, it was established earlier on in his canon that he actually has to remain focused on the illusion that he's conjuring at all times. Like if he breaks the concentration, then the illusion just disappears. So that's also something to consider, even from a psionic powerhouse standpoint. Oh yeah, and his illusions also, if you like try to touch them, like you can go right through them. So probably won't touch them because that's how good of illusions they are, but if you do see a wall and you decide to run through it, you'll get through it and then the illusion is broken. So you can still break them. They're breakable. Having a powerful mind is of course great, but it doesn't mean that you'll come out on top. Look, Brainiac 5 is often presented as being allergic to Earth's germs, so while he is a powerhouse when it comes to how much knowledge he has and therefore what he can get done, the fact remains that if he decides to come to Earth to face Superman, which is where admittedly Superman usually is, Brainiac can't even really leave his ship. While not all versions of the character turn him into a physical weakling, more have than haven't ultimately. For the most part, he's a villain whose power is his intellect, not his strength and prowess as a fighter. So while he's still an iconic and dangerous Superman villain, in a one-on-one fight, in most instances, Superman easily takes it. Number 5. Arcade. Who is Arcade, and what makes him so seemingly great and dangerous? And does he own an arcade? No, not really. But what does make him great and dangerous is probably his creativity, and his genius intellect. Arcade doesn't have any powers of his own, but instead crafts death traps in a place that he calls Murder World, typically a place that he builds with his own resources and his own manipulations. He does this by holding hostage people that his employees, or his victims, who are kind of one and the same sometimes to be honest, care the most about in order to make them play his games, or help him run the games, if they're working for him. And while he might seem ridiculous and look kind of atypical for what you'd imagine a master villain to look like, especially a terrifying one, that bow tie though, he ultimately is very good at putting people in terrifying positions that will even make you, as the reader, squirm at times reading about them. I know I do sometimes when I'm reading Arcade. Oh, he's kind of creepy. Number 4, Killer Moth. Killer Moth never comes out on top, which is why a lot of people consider him to be a weaker villain in the DC canon. But at the same time, he should actually be capable of so much more, which is why I included him here on this list. And there have been a few times that he's proven that he could do more. Killer Moth shares similarities with the esteemed and accomplished hero Batman. Both are fans of using gadgets to enhance their fighting prowess and make up for areas where they otherwise might lack, due to basically neither of them having superpowers. The problem with Killer Moth is simply that he doesn't understand how to best utilize his gadgets and equipment, which is why he is usually very quickly defeated as opposed to becoming a serious threat. Number 3, Weasel. Weasel is Jack Hammer, once the ally of Deadpool turned villain against him. His abilities had more to do with getting weapons and getting them into the hands of certain people who needed them. He was basically a glorified arms dealer when we first got to know him, helping to outfit Wade. Eventually, Weasel saw the people he was allied with as his enemies and decided to turn on them, becoming known later as Patient Zero, an alias he took up. He was a pretty ruthless villain, but at the same time, he isn't actually known for having any specifically inherent powers. Even when he was powered, I would say that was not really what made him so dangerous. What makes him so dangerous is his ability to manipulate situations and, with his genius intellect, turn people against one another. Despite the fact that Deadpool did his best to save Weasel before he ended up perishing when the Assassin's Guild was looking for him, Weasel still blames Deadpool for everything that had gone wrong in his life, including his recent death and his return to hell. It was then that Weasel was able to make a deal with Mephisto that if he could get Deadpool to be his personal assassin, that he would be able to return to life. Being as wily as Weasel is, he was able to negotiate this into happening, which makes him a pretty dangerous villain for someone who doesn't actually have any superpowers currently to speak of. Number 2, Punchline. Punchline isn't super weak, but she is super new, having only been around for a few years in the comics, and so because of this, many people see her as a weaker villain, being a new kid on the block. You know, she hasn't really earned her stripes yet. But at the same time, she shows great potential. One of the things that I think is so impressive about her is how straight up ruthless she seems, preferring to prioritize her own bigger picture over anyone else that she might be working with or working for. That, and she's already shown great aptitude for chemistry and poison/toxin making. Number 1, Bob. Weirdly, but also I guess kinda unweirdly, Bob, who is the initial reluctant ally of Deadpool, ends up also becoming one of his villains. Not his greatest villain or anything, and not a big villain that we all talk about, but definitely, I would say at one point, one of his villains. But while Bob has a long list of weaknesses, he also used to work for Hydra, so he may have some knowledge of Hydra that could be useful. And while his plans don't usually go to plan, he does have some pretty decent ones. Enter his plan to send an alternate version of Deadpool, known as Hulkpool, back in time to kill Deadpool. I mean, he sent him to the wrong timeline, but still, that's a pretty cool plan. And the fact that he had access to a time platform to enact this plan was pretty impressive, honestly, especially for Bob. Granted, this plan did not work, so he still remains probably the weakest villain on this list, hence why I'm putting him at our top spot, but also still has the potential at least to be an epic villain at some point in the future. I certainly would love to see it. I don't think anyone would be expecting it if Bob was master villain all of a sudden.
And number 10 is I Scream. Now I need to get something off my chest. I Scream here is a mutant with the ability to transform himself into any flavor of ice cream. Literally any flavor, which gives me so many questions. But he has named himself I Scream, like I as in eyeball and scream. Why? Why not just go with straight up ice cream? Or I, like the letter, scream. In the comments, give me your ideas for what would be a better ice cream related supervillain name other than eyeball scream. Please, banana split you in half or something like that, just anything. Either way, I Scream was a villain of the X-Men who appeared one time, when he decided he needed to destroy the X-Men using their danger room. He actually got pretty far in that plan, sneaking into the mansion in his melted ice cream form, and was even able to overload Cerebro, taking down Professor X temporarily, before Xavier came back to and lowered the temperature in the room, freezing Ice Scream's ice cream form, which is when a clown turned him into a banana split and split from the scene. I'm not even joking. Just go read Mxyzptlk the Clown from 1983 and you'll see all you need to see. And at number 9 is Turner D. Century. Clifford F. Michaels was the son of a chauffeur of a millionaire named Morgan Riley. Now after his father passed on, Clifford was adopted by Riley, who was criminally obsessed with the values of the very early 20th century. And in order to instill those same values into Clifford, he closed off the boy's access to the outside world. Because of this, Clifford despised the social norms of the modern world when he was finally an adult and exposed to society. This is what made him become a villain, dubbing himself Turner D. Century. He donned a handlebar mustache, a straw boater hat, and a striped green jacket and set himself to attacking any person or anything that represented modern society. So basically everything. After being defeated by Spider-Woman, he escaped prison somehow and developed the Horn of Time, which would allow this unremarkable hero to end the lives of anyone under the age of 65. Absolutely diabolical. But don't worry, the horn didn't even work and just knocked down anyone under 65 in a very limited range, who, as you can imagine, did have the bodily strength to get themselves back up again, and he was quickly taken down by Spider-Man. And at number 8 is the Slug. The Slug is just super fat. I wish I was joking, but like, this dude is obese to the point of immobility. He simply cannot stand up under his own power and needs a high-tech personal hovercraft to just get around. Luckily, he is a Miami-based crime lord, which means he can afford both his little hovercraft and the ungodly amounts of food that he needs to constantly be eating. On the plus side for Ulysses Lugman, his large amounts of fat let him float in water. It makes his vital organs basically impervious to attack and gives him a limited immunity to poison. He is essentially completely useless though against any opponent, which means he relies heavily on his goons, although he does have enough fat that he is infamous for completely suffocating victims between his rolls. Unlike a lot of large characters like this, the Slug isn't actually a mutant, and doesn't technically have any actual superpowers, although it is worth noting that the official handbook of the Marvel Universe claims that Slug technically is a mutant because, and I quote, "It is difficult to imagine how a normal person could achieve such tremendous mass and still remain alive." I actually had a blast making this list, and if you guys love fun topics like this, make sure you like this video and subscribe here at Top 10 Nerds so I can make more. Thank you. But in at number 7 is White Rabbit. For someone so incredibly inept at committing crimes, White Rabbit sure does have a relatively long history in Marvel Comics. In the beginning, sheltered rich girl Lorena Dodson committed her first crime by ending the life of her 87-year-old arranged husband, as she found the trophy wife life boring. She then used her inheritance to buy a bunch of high-tech equipment and, being inspired by Alice in Wonderland, she went off as the villainous White Rabbit. For her first crime, she shall rob a fast food joint. This dastardly crime brought her into confrontation with the most fearsome of heroes, Frogman. And she almost brought him down too if it wasn't for the intervention of Spider-Man, who finished her off with an astounding amount of ease. Spider-Man has actually defeated her on multiple occasions with the same amount of ease, and she's even been defeated by Mary Jane Watson. Now don't even get me started on the amount of animal-themed villains she has allied with. In fact, she's allied with a lot of other low-level villains, but never to any amount of great success. She does have a giant heavily armed robotic rabbit though, and that part is kinda cool. Number 6, Critical Mass. Okay, so look, we already talked about the Slug, and I just want to say, I think Marvel has something against severely overweight people. The amount of supervillains who are just massive is actually ridiculous. The Slug, obviously, but like the Blob, the Shadow King, Pink Pearl, and the Kingpin, although that's actually all muscle. And then there's Critical Mass, aka Arnie Gunderson. Arnie was one of Peter Parker's classmates back in the 4th grade, but eventually he gained the mutant ability to project explosive forces from his fingertips, which is actually a really cool power. But that didn't save Arnie from being just a massive man for seemingly no reason. Together with some evil mutants, he formed the Band of Baddies, and with a name like that, you know we got some real winners here. The band abducted another explosive mutant named Mary Beck, which brought them into conflict with Wolverine and Spider-Man. Unfortunately for the baddies though, one of their number threatened Mary, who then accidentally unleashed her powers, taking out every single one of the villains, and we never saw Critical Mass ever again. The end. Lasted 3 issues of Marvel Comics Presents. That's it.
Coming in at number 5, we've got Red Hulk. After a lifetime of hunting the Hulk, General Thunderbolt Ross decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. His own red hands. Assisted by AIM and the intelligentsia, he becomes a Hulk of his very own, this time more crimson than green, and then he sets out to find and fight the Hulk. The more power he draws, the hotter he gets though, so as he goes harder in the paint, the more likely he is to overheat, and if that happens, it's game over. I suppose that's a weakness most people have. If you fight too hard, you're gonna pass out, but the Red Hulk takes it to a brand new extreme. Coming in at number 4, we've got MODOK. This one might seem obvious, but it's worth mentioning. MODOK, or a mental organism designed only for killing, was once an ordinary man. George Tarleton was a skilled technician who ended up joining AIM. He knew they were a little radical, but not to the extent that he found out later on. The organization altered George into a super intelligent being, which made his dome grow to unheard of sizes, and then realized they should probably give him a way to move around. Thus, the Doomsday Chair was born, carting MODOK around by levitating. He would think circles around everyone, using his brilliant mind, and even had psionic powers, but if he's rendered chairless, it's game over. Or if someone turns his power off. Coming in at number 3, we've got Harley Quinn. Another genius with an Achilles heel, but Harley's really has nothing to do with her own limitations. She's just a sucker for love. Or manipulation if you look at it objectively. The Joker, while serving time on Arkham, managed to brainwash poor Dr. Quinn. He broke her down and built her back up in his image. She's super smart, super resourceful, and super popular, but she's always got this thorn in her side, Mr. J. When your weakness is an over-dependent relationship with a gaslighting lunatic clown man, you know you've got it rough. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Joker. Speaking of lunatic clown men, wow, who would have guessed? The trickster of Gotham, the prince of pranks, the maniac who causes a lot of problems for everyone. He manages to outsmart and outplay all sorts of powerful folks through sheer ingenuity and madness. Because beyond all those crazy gadgets and brainwashed lackeys, the Joker is just a man. And men are weak to bullets, or knives, or being punched through the chest. Finally at number 1, we've got Kingpin. And speaking of men, Kingpin loves his wife a lot. Like enough to make some major mistakes. She does not approve of his criminal lifestyle, but finds herself involved anyways. So when you look to all of the other villains with tragic backstories and Achilles heels the size of Achilles himself, you have to wonder how Kingpin feels. Ask him about his weakness and he'll respond, "My wife." Now you've got all the know-how necessary to take down some of the most dangerous individuals in comics.
Number 10, Hugo Strange. This character first debuted in Detective Comics number 36 back in 1940. He's from the Golden Age and is one of Batman's first recurring villains, and the first to discover his secret identity, but not in a cool way, at least not at first. In the Golden Age it was more of an, oh, Bruce Wayne walked by and there was a bat shadow, haha, he's Batman. Hugo Strange started off as a scientist who stole a concentrated light machine to take on Batman. He didn't even become associated with being a doctor medical type until the 70s. Despite his historical significance, he wasn't really much of a threat, and his plots were, well, pretty silly, though that could be par for the course. The Doctor Strange people have come to know and appreciate wasn't introduced till after Crisis, so post-Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. Here he is a psychiatrist trying to capture Batman, but he becomes obsessed. His whole origin was tweaked. It made him a much more compelling character, and also eventually increased his intelligence and strategizing levels. He moved up from being a one-time threat to someone who worked in the shadows and can mobilize other threats against Batman. Cold, clinical, and insane, Strange began to make the leap into adaptation, and has now become a recognized character, from appearing in video games, to Gotham, to even Batman the Animated Series. Hugo Strange has secured his place amongst Batman's impressive rogues gallery. Number 9, Kite Man. Kite Man comes to us from the Silver Age, debuting in Batman number 133 from 1960. He was a man who decided the best way to commit crimes was with kite-themed weapons, for what is more menacing than a kite? This character quickly became a joke and was treated as such, an inconvenience rather than a credible threat, and really his whole getup was kind of unwieldy. But wait for it, wait longer than Crisis, we need to go all the way to DC Rebirth for this upgrade, where all of a sudden Kite Man got a makeover and a tragic backstory. He becomes a linchpin in the backstory of other criminals, for example working to design the Joker mobile, and his villainous career was a result of failed dreams. He ends up getting dragged into events he never anticipated. His affinity for kites is now an homage to his son. It's all sad, it's daring you to laugh at it. Now it's kinda like, oh yeah, you thought it was funny? Well, look at this. He becomes Kite Man because his son was killed and his son loved kites. This was during the War of Jokes and Riddles, and he takes on the mantle of Kite Man as the ultimate joke before joining the Joker's side and viewpoint. It's an update, that's for sure. Number 8. Dr. Light. Dr. Light has had a rocky journey as a villain. We're talking about Arthur Light here, not Jacob Finlay. Arthur first debuted in Justice League of America number 12 back in 1962, and at first was a villain who fought against the Justice League and the Green Lantern, etc. But then became kind of a joke when he was paired up against the Teen Titans, the first iteration, not the cool 80s New Teen Titans iteration. No, the popular but aggressively hip 60s version. What's the pitch, Daddy-O? Yeah, it was kind of hard to have cred when you're fighting teens. However, then something would occur that would ruin Light's character for years. Identity crisis. This 2004 storyline would turn Dr. Light into a rapist. Why? Just cuz. He has no motivation. It's literally, oh, I'm on the JLA watchtower and Sudibni is here too, so I'm evil and I guess why not. So after this he was mind wiped by Zatanna, and this is said to be the reason for his more kiddish switch, and hence why he became a less credible villain. But then he becomes aware of what happened, and well, he becomes a menace once more. But for a while writers would just make him rapey. He talked about it all the time. The New 52 would change all this, making him a more enhanced metahuman who was a threat from the start. I mean, one could argue since he's on Teen Titans Go so much, he's still jokey, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. All villains have a function, and if you end up the villain of an A team, even if they're a bunch of teens, hey, that's not so bad. At least not in my opinion anyway. Number 7. Mr. Mind. Mr. Mind first appeared in Captain Marvel Adventures number 26 back in 1943. He is a 2-inch telepathic worm who is an evil mastermind. The concept is inherently silly, but one of those ones that does a 180 and becomes awesome. An evil worm. It's too good. He formed the first supervillain comic team, the Monster Society of Evil. Don't let your dreams be dreams. Still, Mr. Mind would vanish for quite a while after the folding of Fawcett Comics. A lot of Billy Batson, at the time Captain Marvel, his characters were considered quite outlandish and were a bit too kiddish. That was some of the mindset. But Mr. Mind would return with a vengeance in the 70s. Now Mr. Mind was never useless, but he was kind of niche and less well known. The concept of him has become cooler over time, and the thing is, he keeps being shelved. People aren't sure what to do with him. But thanks to Shazam, people are aware of this little critter again, and just how powerful he can be. This is Mr. Mind's time to shine, or at least I hope it is. Please give me Mr. Mind as the lead villain in a movie. I want the plushie. Think of how cute that would be. Number 6. Kraven the Hunter. Scandalous, some of you cry. But Kraven was not always considered the hardcore cool character he is today. In fact, a lot of that cred can be attributed to Kraven's Last Hunt, where he quite succinctly takes down Spider-Man just to prove he can. Kraven first appeared in the Amazing Spider-Man number 15 back in 1964. He's also the Chameleon's half-brother. Fun fact. Kraven is Sergei Kravenov, and well, here's the thing, certain Spidey writers at the time didn't like him. They thought he was silly. It was only during the Last Hunt storyline when DeMatteis learned that the character was Russian and made him think that he should have a tragic personality to match. Kraven's Last Hunt was initially conceived with another character in mind, and then it became a Kraven story afterwards. This began Kraven's ascent to beloved villain, though of course some have been there all along, villain hipsters. Kraven is now sought after to be adapted into live action. Whenever people hear there's gonna be a new villain, there's always a group who's like, Kraven? What? Where?
Number 5. Crazy Quilt. I have to applaud this DC villain for being a supervillain with a disability, something we don't see as often as not. Still, his being a diverse supervillain was not enough for him to be saved from being turned into a not so strong supervillain by DC writers. Paul Decker was blinded by a gunshot while being captured during a robbery. He was a former painter turned thief. While in prison, he volunteered for an experimental procedure to help him regain his vision. This worked, but only partially. Paul could now see, but he could only see crazy, bright, and blotchy colors, granting him limited and disoriented vision. Seeing the world this way eventually drove him insane, leading him to adopt the supervillain alias Crazy Quilt. He built a patchy, bright costume and a helmet that flashes blinding lights, among other things. His lack of sanity combined with his lack of powers and lack of true ingenuity when it comes to his gimmick make him an unfortunately easy villain to defeat. Not super useful. Number 4. Sportsmaster. Another villain who seems to be masterful at getting away is Sportsmaster. Not so masterful at fighting though. Not even masterful really at playing sports. Lawrence Kroc is a DC villain who is known for tangling with Green Lantern. He used to be a professional athlete, and although he did have skills, he always took things too far and put winning above everything else. Becoming known for his cheating, he was eventually banned from all sports after severely injuring an opponent on the field. And once his sports career was over, he decided to turn to a life of crime. So interesting that people fail in their careers and immediately deflect to this. Crime ain't that easy, you know. Finding another job might be your best option, cause not everyone can pull this off. Case in point, old Sportsmaster here. Sportsmaster disguises himself and fights with, well, sports equipment. So you can imagine how successful his career must be. One of his signature go-tos in a fight is to escape by faking his death. Now, that's no way to win a fight. You'll survive though, so that's a plus, I guess. Number 3. Kite Man. In his original incarnation, this supervillain was pretty useless. Even within his newer incarnation, he's pretty useless. Chuck Brown fights with just what you think he fights with, kites. And just as you'd expect, he is handily defeated every time he pops up in the comics. I feel like a big downfall of some of these gimmicky supervillains is that they get too attached to their gimmick. For some reason, writers keep bringing the DC villain back as well. He often tussles with Batman and was at least given a cooler hang glider to fly around in on, but still Batman manages to out-hang glide him. In New 52, he was given a tragic backstory, wherein his son ended up murdered by the Riddler, who poisoned Charles Jr.'s kite string that he held onto. Heartbreaking. What's even more heartbreaking is they gave him this sad story and still no cool way to avenge it. How unfortunate. Number 2. White Rabbit. I'm talking about Jayna Hudson this time, Batman's nemesis from DC. Her powers are neat, but not really useful if you're looking to battle someone. Distract them? Maybe. But that's not really how you win a fight or are useful in a fight. She might be able to survive one though. Her powers give her slightly heightened speed and she is pretty good at escaping. In fact, as soon as a hero shows up, that's her usual go-to move, to just run away. Which gives you an idea as to how powerful she is. She does have a unique ability which allows her to split herself into 2 people, separating her White Rabbit persona and her civilian persona, Jayna Hudson. However, these 2 personas are quite different, so it isn't even like she can really use her civilian self to help her take on the good guys. Number 1. Condiment King. The Condiment King originally debuted in the Batman animated series, and was created with the intention of being comic relief. So you can imagine, for this reason alone, he's probably not going to be very helpful in a fight. In fact, in the episode he first appeared in, when confronted and chased by Batman, he actually slips on his own ketchup and almost tumbles to his death. You know you're no match for a hero when you are defeated by your own villainous devices. He was later revealed to have been a former comedian who was brainwashed by the Joker, so it's good to know that he isn't an actual villain who takes himself seriously. Still, the brainwashing messed him up, and he has since continued to try and take on heroes, jumping from the animated series to comics like fellow but ultimately more successful villain Harley Quinn. See crazy bright and blotchy colors, granting him limited and disoriented vision. Seeing the world this way eventually drove him insane, leading him to adopt the supervillain alias Crazy Quilts. He built a patchy bright costume and a helmet that flashes blinding lights, among other things. His lack of sanity combined with his lack of powers and lack of true ingenuity when it comes to his gimmick make him an unfortunately easy villain to defeat. Not super useful. Number 4. Sportsmaster. Another villain who seems to be masterful at getting away is Sportsmaster. Not so masterful at fighting though. Not even masterful really at playing sports. Lawrence Kroc is a DC villain who is known for tangling with Green Lantern. He used to be a professional athlete, and although he did have skills, he always took things too far and put winning above everything else. Becoming known for his cheating, he was eventually banned from all sports after severely injuring an opponent on the field. And once his sports career was over, he decided to turn to a life of crime. So interesting that people fail in their careers and immediately deflect to this. Crime ain't that easy, you know. Finding another job might be your best option, cause not everyone can pull this off. Case in point, old Sportsmaster here. Sportsmaster disguises himself and fights with, well, sports equipment. So you can imagine how successful his career must be. One of his signature go-tos in a fight is to escape by faking his death. Now, that's no way to win a fight. You'll survive though, so that's a plus, I guess. Number 3. Kite Man. In his original incarnation, this supervillain was pretty useless. Even within his newer incarnation, he's pretty useless. Chuck Brown fights with just what you think he fights with, kites. And just as you'd expect, he is handily defeated every time he pops up in the comics. I feel like a big downfall of some of these gimmicky supervillains is that they get too attached to their gimmick. For some reason, writers keep bringing the DC villain back as well. He often tussles with Batman and was at least given a cooler hang glider to fly around in on, but still Batman manages to out-hang glide him. In New 52, he was given a tragic backstory, wherein his son ended up murdered by the Riddler, who poisoned Charles Jr.'s kite string that he held onto. Heartbreaking. What's even more heartbreaking is they gave him this sad story and still no cool way to avenge it. How unfortunate. Number 2, White Rabbit. I'm talking about Jayna Hudson this time, Batman's nemesis from DC. Her powers are neat, but not really useful if you're looking to battle someone. Distract them? Maybe. But that's not really how you win a fight or are useful in a fight. She might be able to survive one though. Her powers give her slightly heightened speed and she is pretty good at escaping. In fact, as soon as a hero shows up, that's her usual go-to move, to just run away. Which gives you an idea as to how powerful she is. She does have a unique ability which allows her to split herself into 2 people, separating her White Rabbit persona and her civilian persona, Jayna Hudson. However, these 2 personas are quite different, so it isn't even like she can really use her civilian self to help her take on the good guys. Number 1, Condiment King. The Condiment King originally debuted in the Batman animated series, and was created with the intention of being comic relief. So you can imagine, for this reason alone, he's probably not going to be very helpful in a fight. In fact, in the episode he first appeared in, when confronted and chased by Batman, he actually slips on his own ketchup and almost tumbles to his death. You know you're no match for a hero when you are defeated by your own villainous devices. He was later revealed to have been a former comedian who was brainwashed by the Joker, so it's good to know that he isn't an actual villain who takes himself seriously. Still, the brainwashing messed him up and he has since continued to try and take on heroes, jumping from the animated series to comics like fellow but ultimately more successful villain Harley Quinn.